And thank you all for coming out this evening. It's a huge pleasure to be here talking with Casey about this amazing book. Something that struck me as a fellow writer, an envious fellow writer, as I was reading this, is that it's, in some ways it's a book about a failure, right? It's a book about an extraordinary story and an extraordinary writer who kind of failed to bring it home. And at the same time, it's kind of a triumph in the sense that all these years later, another extraordinary writer does succeed in bringing it home, which is remarkable in and of itself, but also kind of audacious when you think about it. And a number of places in this book, you get this a kind of wonderful scenario, familiar perhaps to some of the reporters out there, which is that somebody kind of alights in a strange land with a notebook and tries to pursue a story and figure out how to report it and figure out how to tell it. And this happens with different people at different times in this book. But it also happened with you. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about how it was that you first came to Alabama and to this story, and what gave you the hubris to think that you would go.
It's a kind questioner. You ask your friends to do this kind of thing, and then they come out with this.
Tough questions from the outset. To take this book that Harper Lee couldn't write and write it so beautifully herself.
Gosh, that's like 100 questions. I'm just going to spend the next 30 minutes with every one of them. So the first thing to say is it wasn't clear to me at the outset that she hadn't written it. And it's certainly the case that, a lot of people very close to Harper Lee, and if you've had the chance to read the book, you see there gathered some of their speculation and some of their intelligence, might be, too strong a word, but a lot of people who knew her at the time think she wrote it and chose not to publish it. So already there was this kind of texture to that mystery of, well, did she write it or did she not? And if she wrote it, how much of it did she write and what did she do with what she wrote? And, those are all possibilities, and, it's a little bit of a factorial down the road of, well, what might there be to find? So it wasn't clear to me from the outset that I was trying to do something she hadn't, although it was clear to me the book I was going to put together would be quite different from whatever she might have written, because I knew she would be in it. And much the same way I didn't want to be in my book, there was no way The Reverend by Harper Lee had a kind of, Harper Lee-like figure in it going about reporting the story. She almost certainly, because she was so private, because she had such a strong notion about the identity of the artist standing outside of their work, she was almost certainly never going to be in The Reverend. So even if we found a full manuscript, and believe you me, like day after day, I was both excited and terrified by that possibility. God bless Knopf, but I think this book would have done not as well if Harper Lee's The Reverend had come out a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And so for a while I thought, are they just going to, cut me loose if The Reverend comes out? Or like, how much of the book does she have to have written for mine to be null and void? So I thought about it, although, truly no one would be more excited to read that manuscript than I would be. And I think there would still be a place for the book I wrote. On the one hand, she had access to more sources than I did. On the other hand, she is a huge part of this book. And I think that the kind of unfinishedness of her story chimes with the unfinishedness of the others. So, this original crime story at the heart of the book is quite strange and involves I tread very lightly. They're not all homicides, for one thing. So there are 5, if not 6, deaths attributed to the Reverend Maxwell, but in some cases, no cause of death was ever determined. So they're unfinished cases in the sense that they were unsolved and no one was held responsible. And same thing when you're writing about a liberal politician in the Deep South. That is a very unfinished story. Open the newspaper, it's still going on in Alabama that people are fighting for their rights and equality and justice. And so it didn't seem that odd to pick up her unfinished story because they all felt that way. And indeed, I don't want to get existential, but all of life feels that way, right? Like where do you ever have a complete story? I mean, maybe if you're doing like some geologic project that ended 10 million years ago and you can definitively say it ended, but otherwise it's always kind of messy and difficult to know where to start and stop. I mean, I can't wait to throw the questions back at you, but, you wrote about a political situation some would say is, unfinished and, unsolved and unresolved. And, what about you there, with your wee little notebook? I'm going to use the Irish language that got thrown at Patrick, your wee little notebook. You show up trying to solve a murder.
I think you can wait just a little longer to throw the questions back at me. But tell me about the beginning, though. I mean, had you known about?
Yeah, I dodged. So the matter of fact question here is, the softball. Sorry, I was aiming for the stands. But so the logistical kind of how did I find this story? I was a huge Harper Lee fan as a kid, and you wouldn't really know it to look at me now, but I looked exactly like Mary Badham, the actress who plays Scout in the film adaptation, and so I just immediately over-identified with that character. And my dad's not a lawyer, but I was a daddy's girl, and I was a tomboy, and I was a nerd, and so that book was basically written for me. And I had always wanted to see Monroeville, and I had done these like southern driving trips, and I love to drive, but I had never made it to the town where Harper Lee was born and raised. And not that the novel is purely autobiographical, but the town where she was born bears a strong resemblance to the town she created in the novel, and I'd wanted to see it. So in 2015, when Go Set a Watchman was announced, for 50 years Harper Lee had said, I'm never publishing another book, and then she up and announces, in her 80s that she's publishing this book. And her older sister, who had been her caretaker and kind of business manager, had died a few months before that, and so there were all these questions about the provenance of that manuscript of Watchmen and about her ability to consent to publication. And so, with a big scrum of reporters from everywhere else, I went down and was looking into that book when I found out about this other book she had tried to write. And it was interesting and strange, and, given 1,000 years, I would never have guessed it was what Harper Lee was up to in the years after To Kill a Mockingbird. And the more I looked into it, the more interesting it was, and the more people who were still alive, who had been involved in the original crime case. And, music to a reporter's ears, nobody had really tried to write this book because they all thought Harper Lee was going to do it. And, she'd been squatting on the story for 40 years. And, everybody would say, like, oh, the voodoo preacher, what a great story. But, Harper Lee's got her name all over it. And it seemed like, there was a kind of sweet spot between the possibility of her having written it and the opportunity to write a book that included her work as well.
And in terms of that idea, the reporter arrives in town and is not a native.
I didn't bring a footlocker full of food.
See, that's your mistake. Yeah. There's a wonderful moment for those of you who haven't read the book yet, where Capote shows up in Kansas, having provision for what he initially assumes will be a short trip with a footlocker full of food. You don't go into all. I was, of course, wondering. Is it? What is it? What was in it? Yeah, I don't caviar.
Presumably,
right.
He thought he wouldn't be able to find in Kansas.
Right, and then it turns out the stay is longer than he anticipated, and he runs out. No,
I happily lived off Huddle House and Waffle House, and the great Southern specialties these days. I brought no provisions.
This is as it should be. But did you go knowing? I mean, I'm just wondering about the process of you, the sort of your own sense that there might be a book here, but then also your sense that it was a book that you could report and write. I mean, there's the book is so steeped in, and the envy is going to come through again here, a sense of the place. And I mean, I know, having tried to do that sort of thing myself, that's earned. It takes considerable work.
That's an Alabamian dissenting that I've done exactly. Justice to, because they're her home state.
Step forward in the Q&A back there.
Don't worry, I'm not going to try to say pecan.
So what was that process like?
So I had never been to Alabama before I went to report that story, and I went, and I loved Monroeville, and dare I say, I made some friends kind of right away, and I felt like, even though I hadn't been there, I understood the dynamics of a small town like that. It was very much like where I'd grown up, and the kind of parochialisms and regionalisms felt familiar to me, and I was really energized by that initial reporting, and I, really admired Harper Lee's work, and I wanted to know more about it. And this other case was interesting in its own right, and I had a little bit of resistance to the idea of the true crime portion of the book as the truth. I was totally fascinated by Tom Radney, the lawyer. So the book is basically a triptych, and the first third is about the Reverend who was accused of these murders, and the second third is about the lawyer who defended him and then defended the vigilante who murdered him, and the third part is Harper Lee. And I was tremendously interested in that attorney, and I love political history, and I'm very interested in people who stay in a place that would rather not have them. And in that way, Tom felt like a familiar character to me, and I wanted to understand why he had stayed and why he hadn't left, and sort of the ways his ambition had morphed and evolved in this place. And same thing for Harper Lee. I mean, quite interestingly, she lived a lot of her adult life in Manhattan, but she maintained this lifelong connection to Alabama. And for a woman of her means and of her politics and of her kind of cosmopolitan verve, and I'm going to pause lightly, I know one of her godsons is here, and so I'm mindful there might be people in this room who know her better than I do, so I tread lightly in my characterizations of someone I never met, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about. She could easily have just been a Manhattanite, and instead she went home every year to Alabama, and I wanted to understand that, so she felt familiar to me. And the Reverend was a tantalizing character to get to write about, and I'm interested in rural religion, and I'm interested in superstitions and how people make sense of the world around them, particularly when it defies explanation or accounting. And so it felt like between the three of them, it was more than enough for a book. And that I would get to do different kinds of writing too. And there was just an initial question for me, and this is the kind of the David Gran rule: was there enough stuff? So there were enough people, and there were people who had lived through all this, and there was archives in the local papers and things, but I waited until I could get autopsies and birth certificates and death certificates, and really made sure some of the initial fact-finding checked out, and some court documents turned up, and insurance documents from the civil cases, and then it just felt like, okay, I do have enough facts to build off of. And kind of the same thing for Harper Lee. I was lucky enough to start this book. She was still alive. I didn't get to interview her, but people in her life.
Did you try?
Did I try? Yes. I mean, I was one of many reporters who went to the Meadows in Monroeville only to be turned away by the armed guard who had conspicuously taken up his post there. And, I did get to know friends and family of hers, and that was meaningful and useful. But the coincidence of timing was that some of those folks were alarmed by Watchmen and worried about her in that sense. And then after she died in 2016, there's kind of another wave of folks who decided to talk to me because they felt the kind of omerta of Harper Lee ended with her death. And that they wanted, for posterity's sake, to talk about their friend and to make sure that there was a rich and complicated version of her in the world, even if that meant revealing things that might have been embarrassing to her during her lifetime.
Fascinating. And there's a great Janet Malcolm quote that you cite here about how between the process of reporting and writing is, I think, what Malcolm calls an abyss. So you're there, you're doing the reporting. I mean, you hinted at the structure of the book, and I just wonder at what point you arrived at the notion of 3 books, each focusing on one of these individuals.
Yeah, I mean,
Did you know that from the start?
Yeah, I was about to say, I wish there was some kind of complicated division problem or calculus. No, it came to me that way, and it seemed obvious that would be how it worked. There's a kind of elegant chronology to that, too, because the Reverend was born in 1925. He dies in 1977. As far as the book is concerned, this isn't spoiling it for you because this is sort of revealed in the prologue, but the book then hands off to the attorney, whose kind of climax in the story is 77 and 78. So he's dealing with the trial of the vigilante, and you get his backstory and things like that, but then immediately he hands it off to Harper Lee, who we kind of follow forward to 2016. So that chronology was underlying the 3 character sections.
Yeah, and was there so one of the things I was fascinated by is that, and we'll get into the many, many, many possible reasons why Harper Lee failed to finish this book or any other subsequent to Mockingbird. But one of the reasons seems to be, or one of the things she struggled with, was writing about the Reverend in a way that felt kind of intimate or granular enough to meet her her standards, and part of that seems to have been a function of the way in which the lives of African Americans were recorded. I mean, the kind of paper trail that would have been available to her at that time. So for you, coming along and trying to write about the Reverend, were there similar? I mean, did you find yourself confronting similar challenges, or and how did you deal with them?
Sure. Of course I did, and I tried to be conspicuous about some of them in the kind of text of the book and also in the notes. But yeah, I mean, in a lot of instances, you're relying on oral history, and where, when you want to know where Tom Radney or Harper Lee worshipped as a kid, you can go to their church and it's brick and mortar and it's still worshiping every Sunday. And if you want to go and look at some of these rural black churches where the Reverend preached or led revivals, they don't exist. They're torn down, and they were not brick churches to begin with, and maybe somebody's converted it into a house. You can get a sense of where it was, or you can get an old town map and you can figure out where approximately it was located. But even the architectural history is harder to come by in some instances, and so you rely on oral history. And in the case of official documents, some of the local newspapers had quote Negro sections, so you can get a little bit of a sense of what black life was like. And some of those early WPA histories go into the lives of black sharecroppers in the region. And there's actually a great coincidence of geography to this story. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Notasulga, Alabama, which is one of the places where the Reverend preached. So there's a little bit in her autobiography. You can learn about that town. And then this book is set in Coosa and Tallapoosa County for the most part in Alabama. And Theodore Rosengarten, if you've ever read All God's Danger, that tremendous oral history of the life of a sharecropper is in Tallapoosa County, because that's where the communist uprising was. So, between that and Agee and Walker Evans are like writing about a similar time, but across the state, and mostly white sharecroppers. But there's some material to draw on, and the WPA files have some of what life was like then. But yeah, I mean, a lot of those facts in the Reverend section are hard won, and you would hear it from one person and have to get them to kind of stretch out a sense of what the pattern of life was like. But when you do it for Harper Lee, you can ask 10 people who lived on her street, and they all remember, or they all wrote up their memories for the local paper, or in the case of Harper Lee, her father was the editor. So you go and you can see like what was served at her sister's birthday party, and when she turned 9. And so that is in strong contrast to the Reverend, where the kind of nuts and bolts of his life, you get his Army service records, you get his birth certificate, you get marriage certificates, sometimes you can find a tax bill or a mortgage deed, but the official paperwork really heats up in terms of the criminal trials and the civil litigation. So I think in the instances like where there's real gaps, I just tried to be conspicuous about it and use it as a way to talk about how history is formed. And obviously I'm lucky in the section with Harper Lee, I can use her as a way to talk about the decisions any true crime writer makes about victims and perpetrators and characterization. And you're always dependent on who cooperates and who gives over material. So I think the best we can do sometimes when we can't do a full portrait of everyone is kind of talk about why.
Yeah.
And not fudge or invent details where they don't exist,
but make it explicit. I mean, it's interesting that I think you did that very effectively while also not putting yourself in the text of the book.
Yeah, I didn't want to tell you about the time I was like in the Rockford courthouse and they just let me down in the records and I, got locked in the room, that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, I didn't want to say like, boy, the record keeping in Coosa County could really use some, or, yeah. That's usually. Sure. You don't get all the, nuts and bolts of that, or how much it costs for photocopies in Alabama, or when Luther Strange was, Attorney General and told me to like get the heck out of Alabama. And leave those out. Those are not what make it into the book.
So this issue of true crime. I mean, there's a wonderful section in this book which is about, and I confess I did not know. I didn't fully grasp the chronology, but having written Watchmen I think it took 2 months.
Yeah, if you want to feel bad, I know Harper Lee has this reputation as a one-hit wonder and someone who struggled to be productive. I called it Mondays with Maurice in the book. Her agent was Maurice Crane. She showed up every Monday with 50 new pages. And, it was a draft. It had to be revised. It didn't go to print that way. But yes, she had this period of tremendous productivity.
And then, so she does that, and then, which is kind of a land speed record, and then writes To Kill a Mockingbird, and turns the book in, and there's this period of time, as the book goes through the process of getting ready for publication, during which she's looking for a job. And it's at that point that her old friend Truman Capote says, "Hey, I'm going to Kansas and looking for a research assistant. I'll pay you," I think it was $900.
It's almost as much as she made for Mockingbird.
Yeah. So
plus expenses.
She needs the cash. The kind of duet of these two friends, which runs through the book, is wonderful. So they go off together before Mockingbird comes out. And then eventually, having done the initial reporting, Capote's not ready to finish In Cold Blood yet, at which point To Kill a Mockingbird comes out and becomes this massive success. And it kind of goes back and forth. But during the interlude when they're in Kansas, you describe how intimately involved Lee was in the reporting and actually the assembly of scenes and characterization, to a point where where she hands this 100 some odd page detailed outline to Capote, and I'm thinking, Harper Lee wrote In Cold Blood. She did write another book. It was called In Cold Blood. But
well, I have to say, when I started this book, I'd get these questions all the time that were like, "Did Truman Capote write To Kill a Mockingbird?" So I'm just glad that it swung in the other direction. Where now they're like, "Did she write In Cold Blood?"
It's hyperbole in one direction or the other.
Yeah.
But so here's my question: the genre of true crime. Literary true crime, I suppose. I mean, you suggest that In Cold Blood really was kind of changed the paradigm. There was one that Lee ended up feeling uncomfortable with, and another one of the reasons why she ends up struggling to write the book that she wants to about the Reverend is that she, as you describe it, she feels as though she has a certain distaste for the conventions of the genre, where she's uncomfortable describing the murders. She feels there's something kind of sensationalist and exploitative about it, and yet she's kind of wise enough to know that there are these commercial imperatives that mean that she would have to do that, and so she ends up stuck between what she knows she would need to do and what she feels unable to do. And I do wonder how you felt as you embarked on this. And dealt with those same dilemmas, at a different time, but at a time when true crime is a genre. There are people who will pick this book up not because they're Harper Lee fans, but because it's
that's why the Tallapoosa River damming scene opens the book, because I think those are the readers who are like, "What on earth are we doing with the, Lake Martin? Like, geez, give me some bodies. Why are we filling a reservoir?" There's a little bit of like, so you must be this tall to ride the ride. Yeah.
I love it.
So hopefully that's just barrier to entry. But no, of course I was mindful of that. I mean, in the instance of this book, on the one hand, the Reverend was accused of killing family members, so it's all in the family for the Maxwells. On the other hand, there are living descendants of some of these women and some of these people, and widows and people very much alive who remember the victims in this book as living, breathing people. And the Reverend's stepdaughter, who was 16 when she was found murdered, has a lot of biological siblings, and the vigilante who murdered the Reverend is alive and was related to her, and there is a lot of grief and loss and mourning around this story, and even around the Reverend himself. Obviously, some members of his family believe he was innocent of all of these crimes and that his murderer was never held responsible. So, whatever kind of general obligation you feel to treat your sources and subjects respectfully and carefully, which I feel, whether you're writing about a tech company or a garbage disposal company, I certainly felt with this book. And the more people I met who had lived through all this, and the more people who were worried that this sensational story would be somehow used to malign or misrepresent their community, which I think is where the book has a lot in common with In Cold Blood, because on the one hand, you want to write about this as a representative episode in a certain place and time, but you also want to lift up all of the other lives around it and all of the people who experienced it. And so over and over again, I felt myself entering into, kind of emotional pacts with people about how the book would try and be honest, but also be respectful and empathetic. And, this started as about the true crime portion, which is really the first third, and there are bodies and there are people who were murdered and died. And that's one kind of challenge. But obviously with a writer as famous as Harper Lee, I met a lot of people who knew her well and loved and cherished her and didn't want to embarrass her. And so there was another kind of fear there around how are you going to represent our beloved friend or aunt or, godmother or whatever the kind of structural relationship was. And everybody in this book, everybody in any book worries about how they will be represented. And that's not only in the genre of true crime, that's not all nonfiction, anytime you're writing about other people. I felt it kind of evenly throughout the three sections.
Yeah, but you weren't stymied by it in the end.
No, I mean, I believe in contracts and deadlines and that kind of thing. I say if poor David Haglund is here, I do believe in deadlines. I will get that one done soon enough. But that's an editor to whom I owe something these days. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think again, the kind of useful thing you can do for readers is talk about that. And I was very lucky in the case of Harper Lee. I have a very necessary reason for bringing that up. And hopefully, if you're a true crime fan and you're not in it for Harper Lee, what you get to do is sit with a writer as she makes those kinds of decisions. And maybe if you're someone who delights in that genre and you've never thought about the kind of, perspective choices a writer makes or descriptive choices a writer makes or how they assemble documents and give them even or uneven weight, that's one of the things you can do is sort of deliberate with her and learn more about a genre you already love.
Yeah. Fascinating. So just a couple more quick questions, and then I'd love to open it up for questions from all of you. Part of what I love about this book is there are these amazing asides, which they manage to not feel extraneous. If some of you who have not read the book are wondering why this Reverend might have killed all these people, the answer, to the extent that there's a readily explicable one, appears to be insurance. And there's all this stuff about the history of insurance, which was completely fascinating to me. But then also these
my ideal reader. It's not really. It's not a universal opinion. Be warned.
I'm selling the book hard here. Come for the murder, stay for the detailed history of insurance. But voodoo as well, and I mean a whole series of, and also even just the concept of murder, and when it was, when it sort of became a legal concept. Obviously, not one that initially was applied to the killing of Native Americans. But I guess I wondered how you thought about those. The introduction of all of that kind of stuff felt very calibrated to me, because those could potentially have been the type of rabbit hole down which one can fall and then never reemerge. How you thought about that?
Yeah, it's a little bit like the structure for me. There are enough people in this room who've known me for enough years that it's just the way I talk. Like you start telling one story and then you gotta, explain somebody's great uncle in order to understand why the cousin matters, and you just veer around life. And it's how I grew up hearing people narrate their lives, and it feels like the way a good story unfolds. And if you get to the point, why bother? Just why not delight in all the things along the way? And so, why not write the way you talk? And I don't know how to do it otherwise. But, that's not to say that there aren't like tremendous, volumes behind any one of these kind of pockets of explanation, or, these excursions are informed by a lot of other research. And I think there it's about kind of getting the essence right. And you do all this reading and you do all these interviews, and it's never going to show up kind of one-to-one in the book or in the article, but you try as best you can to figure out the salient parts or the interesting parts or the delightful parts. And that's really, that's you, the writer, going out into the world to find it. And sometimes you're actually in the physical world and you're looking at how the trees look around Lake Martin or how the birds sound at night, and sometimes you're just reading a long history of, hydroelectric power, and you learn about how many men it takes to build a dam, or how far down the church bells can go and still sound at the shoreline. And, you're just collecting those kinds of things, and if you're lucky, you have enough time to do it. One of the things I love, this is my first book, and I loved having time to just go looking for things I didn't even know I was looking for, and, have the third or fourth conversation with someone where they told the one story you would never have known to ask, or the person you had been told was dead. You just, had enough time to think, am I sure she's dead? Maybe she's still alive. She's not that old, and go looking for them. So, yeah, I think that it's fun in a book to get to do it, and I'm also mindful, again, I'm kind of joking about this, but it's not a book for everyone. I think there are folks who just want plot and they don't want history or detail, and one of my favorite passages in the book, you talk about how you don't know what you're going to need. So one of the chapters opens with the first Mrs. Maxwell shelling peas. And maybe some of you have done that. I grew up doing it, so it's not as if I didn't know, how it felt or how it sounded to shell peas and ping them into a bowl. But there's a little bit of description that follows that about the kind of texture of that, kind of late summer in Alabama. And it comes from these tremendous letters that a naturalist wrote in the 19th century. And I read this whole volume of letters he wrote back to England. And he was supposedly going to look for snails on the Alabama River or something, but he made his way up. And, he was just an observer, and he watched the mud daubers in his cabinets, and he watched the possums outside, and he watched the insect life, in late summer. And you read a book like that, and all of a sudden you've got the kind of sense of, okay, this is what it's like in Alabama in August. And this is how it sounds, and this is what people see, and this is how a summer evening feels. And you can slow time in a book like this to just sit with a woman who's about to die, and who's just doing the things she's done every summer before that. And it's just a tiny, tiny bit of humanity. And, how could you ever know you were looking for it? You just have to read the whole book that's a year and a half worth of letters home to England by the naturalists.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound easy, but I think actually
it's crazy to me. We get paid to do this. It is fun and delightful and wonderful. And I wish I could read the naturalist letters for everywhere I've ever been. I just got to do it for Alabama.
Okay, so last question for me. You have this is not the beginning of your book tour, and you have already done a swing through the South, and you briefly mentioned to me one pretty crazy story about an almost meet cute at one of your readings between people who were related to folks who were involved in the story. And I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the reception in Alabama and what that's been like for you.
Sure. I mentioned anytime you write about people, they have this, unfortunate habit of going to read what you write about them, and you can't convince them otherwise. No, I've been very lucky so far. So I did the first week of my tour in Alabama, and I was extremely grateful to a lot of librarians and archivists and folks who shared their stories or letters from Harper Lee or experiences they'd had with her. And some of those folks are older, and I knew they would not be able to travel. So I did events in Monroeville, where Harper Lee was born and raised, and Alexander City, where a lot of the book takes place, and Montgomery, where the archives were just tremendously helpful, and Birmingham, and Fairhope, and it was truly, people have heard me made this joke, but it was Johnny Cash, I've been everywhere, man, just in Alabama getting started. And those were really fun events. And for the most part, people, it's extremely gratifying. I am a creature of a place that, I would have very high standards if someone were going to write about where I were from. And it was gratifying to have people who are from Alabama several generations back feel like the book got it. and that it felt like the place they knew and the people they loved, and that it did justice to a story they'd kind of always wanted to see in print, or to a writer they'd always admired but never really understood. And so that event Patrick was referencing was a event in Alexander City where a relative of the Reverend's was there, the vigilante was there who murdered her father, and all of Tom Radney's kids and many of his grandkids were there. So, you gather a room like that, and I have said this at a lot of places, and, this is a strange and sordid story, and there are ways in which it feels not real, and it feels like a ghost story. It feels like a Southern Gothic novel or something. And never was I more mindful than in that room that it's real life for these people, and they lived it in tremendously different ways. And so I think that was an important event to have so early in the book process, because it means I can carry that sentiment into rooms like this, where you may never go to Alabama, you may never see Lake Martin, you may never meet a Maxwell or a Radney or a Lee, but they're real people, and their struggles are real, and the book hopefully kind of makes them feel that way. But in case not, I'm school-marmishly going to remind you that they're real people.
Thank you. On that note, I'm going to school-marmishly ask you all to prepare your questions. I'm sure you have them. I don't know if there is a mic going around. Nope? Okay, so then just shout them, or we can repeat them if necessary. And we got one right here.
I'm so glad I had a chance to hear you on Allison Stewart today, and that's how I heard about this and had become. Then I read Michael Lewis's glowing review of the book in the Sunday Times.
Did my wife put you up to bringing up the Michael Lewis review? It's all she can talk about.
But so I learned a little more about the case, and I'm wondering, the Reverend married the main witness in his trial. How did the wife's husband die?
Do you want the official Alabama, Bureau of Vital Statistics version, or you want the version around Coosa County? Because there's a wide discrepancy. So the death certificate says that Abram Anderson died after 92 days in a VA hospital of pneumonia. People around Coosa County think he was poisoned.
By the Reverend?
By the Reverend,
So
yeah.
his wife, the main witness,
So that he could remarry, yeah. So that's the kind of perfect discrepancy between, people had told me that, and somebody had told me it was that it was antifreeze, and someone else told me a specific voodoo potion it was, and so I hear all this and I go and I request the death certificate, and there's a story. I said I'm like Harper Lee and that I didn't want to be in this book. I'm actually in this book for one page, and it's the epilogue, and I tell you what feels like a kind of important story about recovering some documents, and those documents involved a lot of Harper Lee's reporting materials from when she was working on this case, and I just died because, she paid the same processing fee I did to get a copy of Abram Anderson's death certificate, because presumably she had been told the same thing I had, and went to find out, what the official cause of death was. And, when I've done readings, even down in Alabama, I usually read this kind of riff on some of the voodoo rumors about the Reverend, and I thought for a while that they might have just been offered to me, the kind of young out-of-town reporter, and people were just telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. But another kind of interesting thing about Harper Lee's time in town, one of the most persistent things people said about the Reverend, and this is partly because in some voodoo and hoodoo there's black cat lore, they said he could turn into a black cat if he needed to vanish quickly. And Harper Lee, when she was in town, she's staying in a cabin on Lake Martin, and she adopted a stray cat, which she called Reverend Maxwell, because those rumors were already circulating at the time. So I was just, happy to know people weren't pulling my leg, and, it was just part of the story. And, he was said to have voted in an election 2 years after he died, and strange lights were found over his tombstone, and, here and there and everywhere. And it's interesting. That's the story of the neighbor. There is, I gather for you some of those tremendous stories and superstitions and things. And the reason they had currency there is there were active voodoo and hoodoo communities, and those kinds of superstitions. It wasn't just all love potions and, get out of jail potions. Some of them are just kind of homeopathic remedies, and voodoo was an alternative system of healthcare for people who couldn't afford it, or who, for reasons of racial segregation, were not allowed to go to hospitals or doctors. So I think there it's like the life insurance business. There's a kind of surprising turn. It's easy, and I think that Michael Lewis did a good job of kind of turning the Reverend into a supervillain on par with like Goldman Sachs folks. But the truth of the matter is, the life insurance industry was extremely exploitative at that time. And there have been some tremendous settlements in the last 10 or 15 years for African American clients who were overcharged for policies or sold substandard policies. And so the predation went in both directions. The Reverend might have been a great villain, but it was a villainous industry. So I think there are a lot of turns like that in the book where, there's just, two sides to every story. But I hope you read it. And I met an ethnobotanist when I was in Oxford, Mississippi, who claims he's going to look over all the autopsies again and see what he can come up with. So, if you read the book and you have theories, feel free to get in touch. There's still some live questions around Lake Martin about, how the Reverend did it. And those questions come from coroners as well as, electricians. It's a one-man room. I like it. All right. Nobody. Oh, this guy.
Well, I was thinking about the podcast S-Town, and it takes place in Alabama, and how amazing every person they interview in that is. Even the tattoo part is an amazing storyteller. Everybody, and I was thinking, is that part of? Does Alabama have an amazing oral culture that just lends itself to that kind of storytelling? Did you find that when you're doing interviews?
I mean, Harper Lee would say yes, but remember, I'm from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and I'm going to lift us up as much as I do Alabama. I think anywhere has a tremendous. She one of the last interviews she gave, and it's actually kind of interesting. There's almost as little of Harper Lee's recorded voice as Tennyson, even though she lived until 2016. There's like one thing you can go and listen to on YouTube, and it's like 16 minutes. She did an interview in 1964, and it's a tremendous interview, but she says this utterly absurd thing about how, the South produces storytellers in a way that East 82nd Street doesn't. She was living on East 82nd Street when she said that. Now, maybe she was drawing some kind of distinction about, place of origin or something, but she does make a salient point about how people have time to tell stories there. And it was certainly my experience that, I would go and visit someone for 2 or 3 days, and they would pretend as if I'd come for morning coffee. They'd be like, well, when are you really going to come visit? So I've been here for 3 days. What do you want from me? I got to get home. And, you'd rent a house for 2 months, and it was like, you're leaving already? There was just time. And, I make a joke in the book about how if you ask a question in Alabama, you either get no answer or, you get a whole etiology for where the question began. And, I think it's just time. It's not kind of capacity, but willingness to share, and I really delighted in that. But obviously, every community has shibboleths, and once you learn them, they'll talk to you. And I know, this is Burke Bilger, a tremendous writer for the New Yorker, who has gone and gotten plumieres to talk to him, and gotten bean farmers to talk to him, and there are different ways to access different communities, and if we're lucky, we really get them to open up in deep and meaningful ways. But I don't think I neither take it personally nor take it to be indigenous to Alabama. How about that? But I'll tell you, my friend Becca Laurie is here, and Becca did a tremendous amount of research for me with this book and was a tremendous help. And God bless her, she texted me one day and said, had I heard that Serial was going to be doing a season about a murder in a small town in Alabama, and I about died because I was in the middle of working on the book, and I was like, how have none of my sources told me they're talking to NPR? And then it turned out to be over in Bibb County, and it was fine, and I carried on with my business. But I did have the brief moment where I was like, none of them have mentioned that people are calling from New York to talk to them about their lives and the story. And so I was just glad they found something on the other side of the state.
Did I misunderstand from the radio interview? I thought that Harper Lee was trying to write a novel about. She was doing a true crime novel.
So she started out in town very deliberately and conspicuously talking about a true crime project. And she beat the drum very loudly about how she was doing journalism of the old-fashioned kind and she only wanted facts. And she then said one of the reasons she was struggling was because she couldn't find enough facts. But she then turned out to have tried a kind of novelized version, which makes sense. You know, she had made her name as a writer of fiction, and except for a few pieces of journalism and some reportage in the college newspaper, she had mostly written fiction, so it makes sense she would have tried it out. But she did all of this reporting and gathered all of these documents and, paid the court reporter $1,000 for a copy of the transcript and got these death certificates and went around town with a cassette recorder recording the interviews and typed up notes exactly as she had for Capote with, the time and the place of the interview and exactly what someone had said. So she was really amassing the kind of material you would need for a nonfiction project.
I mean, I'll ask another. I got more. I can go all night.
Honestly, I'm about to have to change what I said about Alabama because the truth is they didn't let me leave. They just had like hours and hours of questions and yeah.
So here's a question. Can you talk a little bit about the voice in this book, the narrative voice that actually runs through all three sections? Because I was trying to think about this. It's strange knowing you because it's
strange knowing me.
Well,
period.
Full stop. Because it's not exactly your conversational voice, and there are places where some of it is the kind of use of the vernacular, and I feel as though it kind of blends with this very intense, kind of resonant sense of place that runs throughout the book. I just wonder how you thought about that when you thought about putting words on the page. Who is this voice? What does it sound like, and does it have any relationship to Lee's voice?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I absolutely tried to saturate myself in everything she had written. So that's like as many letters as I could gather, everything she ever published. And I mentioned that interview only because other than Pistolantes and the Dixie Chicks, it's probably the most repeated MP3 on my computer because I would just have it playing to kind of hear her and listen to the rhythm of her voice and think about word choices and kind of natural metaphors and things like that. And that got more and more important the further I got into her section. So yeah, I think that a book, you need to be in the driver's seat, but you need to kind of learn the pace of the road. And this was a road through Alabama, and I wanted to try and bring in the way that people there talk and the kinds of metaphors they use and the way they talk about time. And so in my wee little notebook, I would sometimes note, what people said. And I did read a ton of those WPA files and these heritage books for the local history, and I would kind of make notes of different, turns of phrase and that sort of business, and tried to bring all of that in. I think the other thing that happened is I was 11 or 12, and I both started going by my middle initial, and I made this list of resolutions, one of which was seriousness above all things, and that has been a kind of writing credo ever since. And so I think probably what's most odd about this book is people who know me would say that, she's hopefully funny and friendly, and the book is serious and only occasionally gives over to humor, and that's just a product of now I sit down to write, and this is the task of writing, and it needs to be accessible, but it can't be anything but serious. Now, I gave up my middle initial for this book only because, to the point of listening to Alabamians, one of my favorites that I encountered writing the book is this civil rights historian, Diane McWhorter, and she's a New Yorker. She used to live in New York. Some of you all might know her, but she wrote a tremendous history of the civil rights movement, the Birmingham campaign, and she knew Harper Lee, so I got in touch with her, and she knew a little bit about this Alex City business, and she said, there's no other Casey Sepp in the world. Get rid of the end. No one's going to confuse you for anyone else. And this was the most horrifying thing I'd ever heard, but it just planted the seed, and I got rid of it. So, to the point of listening to Alabamians, I did it over and over and over again. And so hopefully it sounds, it talks the way they talk and walks the way they walk. But I don't know. They have these beautiful accents and beautiful ways of telling the story, so it's hard not to just mimic.
Yeah. No, I think it works really effectively.
Is there anything you had to cut
Wonderful question to ask a writer. I don't think my editor's here. Wonderful question to ask a writer. The things I cut. Very little. I'm a lazy writer. I rarely write more than I need. But there is, in fact, so the title of the book comes from this talk that Harper Lee gave. Extremely odd thing. She hated to speak in public, but she agreed to give this talk in the 80s as a favor to one of her sisters, and she was evangelizing for her favorite Alabama historian whose work had gone out of print, and she was telling people they needed to read him. And he's an odd historian because his history of Alabama, it's actually the bicentennial of Alabama statehood, 1819, and his history of Alabama stops when it became a state, kind of oddly. And Harper Lee has theories about that, and she said, he was so enamored with the Creek Indians that he couldn't bear to tell the story once their empire had ended. And she says, as we all know, I can assure you I didn't know, and probably no one in that room knew, as we all know, the Creek Nation came to an end in a few furious hours at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And I had read that talk, and I went to the Horseshoe Bend battlefield, which is actually very near where she stayed when she was working on this book. And if you can believe it, she stayed at the Horseshoe Bend Motel in town. And, I was thinking about all those place names, and I knew how much she loved history, and I read a lot about the Creek Indians, and I felt like, for a story about violence, there needed to be a kind of archaeology of violence in the area. And of course, obviously when you're writing about African American lives in the Deep South, that includes the violence of Jim Crow and slavery. But you go one layer below that, and it's the violence against indigenous peoples and the relocation of the Creeks. And I managed to keep a tiny bit of that in the book, and I actually feel that the title, at least for me, kind of chimes with that in a way that hopefully accentuates it. But yes, there were like 600 glorious words about the Creeks that just started out in the Reverend, and then they moved to the lawyer, and then they moved to the writer, and then they moved right out of the book. So yeah, someday that book on the Creeks. But there's a tiny mention of them in there, but yeah.
A few furious words.
Thank you very much. But yes, what a great question. The only other thing that didn't make it in, and this is truly in the category of arcana, but I found this tremendous fact about how the bison used to cross Alabama to get to the salt licks of the ocean. And I loved this kind of, Alabama, you don't realize how beautiful it is. Maybe there's some Alabamians here, but one of the reasons I knew I wanted to write about Lake Martin is it's tremendously beautiful. And Talladega Forest is beautiful, and I only knew the kind of industrial cities of Alabama. And if you've read about the Selma March, Selma, and Montgomery, and Birmingham. But there's just beautiful natural landscape around the state. And I thought about those bison over and over again because I wanted to have some sense of grandeur for a state that had been very put upon and looked down upon, and sometimes rightfully. I mean, my goodness, we were just down there during the abortion ban, and there's a lot of evil and ill in Alabama still today. But yes, I thought about those bison over and over again, and I could never quite figure out how to get them walking to the sea in the book. So the bison and the Creek Indians, those are my, if the book were 1,000 pages, they would be there, but they're not.
Was there ever a point at which you were thinking of the story in terms of an article as opposed to a book, and did it ultimately grow into a book, or was it always a book?
It started as an article. And in the way you can sometimes really just, write something for yourself. The last line of that article is, it has to do with this problem of documents in the family of the lawyer. So it's the last sentence of that article is, the Radney family is sanguine. If Harper Lee didn't write the book, someone else will. It's like, why not me? That was the conclusion, and then it just felt like an imperative. So yeah, it started as an article.
As you were hearing stories and gathering facts, were you compelled to write certain sections as you heard the stories, or did you gather everything first and then write the whole thing?
So I like to write in my head. It's one of the reasons I love to drive. So I mostly drove back and forth from Maryland to Alabama and Maryland to New York. And I didn't drive from Maryland to California, but I drove around California looking for some friends of Harper Lee's there. And I can write like 1,000 or 1,500 words of prose in my head and just kind of carry it around and tinker with it and figure out how to make it sound better and where it goes. And that number never grew. I thought I might be able to write like the whole book that way, but so I was often writing little sections and things. And so when I, for instance, read about the flooding of Lake Martin, this kind of opening scene of the reservoir, this like Terrence Malick like scene of the water just slowly rising up, and the moonshiners taking their stills up, and the watermelons flooding, that was in my head for a while, and I thought, okay, that's where that goes, and bits and pieces like that. So I like to write while I'm doing it. And sometimes there's if I had been reading tonight, I would have read the opening passage of the Harper Lee portion of this book, which is one of my favorite characters. I'm so sad she died at all, but that she died before the book came out, so she never got to read herself in it. I'm just one of the few people who I think would have been pleased with her portrait. But this woman, Marianne Pittman Allen, and oh my gosh, she wrote herself into the book. Like, there was no editing to be done. It was just like this tour de force arrived by fiat and demanded to be, the opening section. And, she barely needed to be edited. I had to go fact check a few things. But sometimes you're lucky and you do meet someone who can make sense of their life or really bring to life a moment in time. And so they just kind of situate themselves. But yeah, I think, I don't know, are you you got to do all the research before you can write, or you write along the way? Or it depends.
This isn't about me, Casey.
Yeah, but I'm looking for tips. I want to do it better next time. How do I?
Yeah, you need all the help you can get. I can write 1,000 words at a time in my head. I'm pretty, that's pretty good.
Come on, what do you carry around?
And Truman Capote had perfect.
You think that's
95% or 93%?
Well, I know it's between 1,000 and 1,500, because actually one of my first jobs in journalism was a column, and I signed up to write a column, and I used to try and write them while I was mowing the grass, so I know how much I can keep in there before I have to get off the lawnmower and go write it down.
I've honestly never heard of anybody doing this before. So you?
Oh, funny.
I mean.
Do you know anybody who drive? What do you guys do in the car? Oh, you're New Yorkers. You're never in the car. You just.
Well, there's that.
I don't have to drive 20 minutes to the grocery store.
But what I mean is actually composing in your head as you go, not having kind of notional ideas of here's where I'd start, but.
No, I wrote. There's a sentence that was the lead in my proposal that I was so happy I got to salvage, because again, I'm a lazy writer. I don't like to write anything that doesn't see the light of day. Nobody dies at a funeral. I wrote it in a kayak. I was kayaking around and got off on a sandbar and wrote it down. I thought,
yeah, but that's
beautiful,
5 words.
Beautiful sentence. No. And what followed was no. Do you want the rest of it? I'll perform the proposal, but no. It's actually not very many words if you think about it. It's you tinker with them some, you move them around.
I'm just feeling.
Now I'm gonna get
terrible about myself.
Just have to get a car, go on those long, Great American road trips, and just turn on the radio and see what happens.
Other questions?
Interesting question. I see Mr. Orloff here, and I don't know. What am I allowed to say? Am I allowed to say anything at all? More to come. It's a good agent. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Edward and Jess and Ruth and Madeline and, oh my gosh, the number of people in this room who did something for this book. You guys have just packed it, and you made it a success, and I'm so grateful to have you here, and my PI and my wife and all of my writerly friends. I sometimes go around pretending I don't like New York, but the truth is I love you all so much. It's so nice to get to see you and to get to celebrate with you. But what's next? I promise. For 4 years, people would say, oh gosh, how are you going to do this? Harper Lee couldn't do it. And instantly, upon publishing this book, it turned into, well, you did it once, are you going to be Harper Lee and never do it again? So more to come. I can't say what, but more to come. Yeah.
Apologize if this was already discussed. I got here a little late. I was wondering, in terms of process, how far into the research did you know that you wanted to tell the story and create distinct segments? And did it come right away, and this was the obvious way to do it?
Yeah, we got that, but I'll put better language on it now, which is divine fiat. It just, it felt like the way it wanted to be told. There was no struggle. Poor Harper Lee, don't tell her, it just came to me that way. And I didn't. If you've read the book, she really just felt like writing was only good if you suffered for it, and it's just not my experience. I love it, and it's fun, and I don't think it has to be misery.
When did you know that you were done with the conversation
conversations and like research portion?
Never. I'm looking at someone here where, the book was in the bag, and when I chased your mother down in Albuquerque, I couldn't even add stuff to it, but I was trying to make sure. This is Harper Lee's godson. Right here, I lived in the building. If you guys know the Hall and Oates building, if you've had a chance to read the book, Alec lived there for a few years. No, I can't stop reporting. Are you kidding? Like, letters walked into those Alabama events, and I just accumulate them and collect them, and I love Alabama Arcana, and I love facts about Harper Lee, and I'll probably, still be writing this book 100 years from now. It's just hard to put it down, and that's why unfinished everything is, right? I'm sure that you're learning new facts about your stories from, your first two books too, and you just keep accumulating information, and maybe you help somebody write a better version, and there will be more books about Harper Lee, so I feel some responsibility to do oral histories and gather information like that, so the next one can be even better than mine was, and the long and the short of it is I just can't stand suspense. Another reason the book works the way it does is like I just am not made for unsolved mysteries. So of course I pick up the phone and respond to the emails and just keep looking for more intel.
Come on. Oh, yeah, we can count on you. Come on.
When did you say case closed and don't you hit, free to do other writing if you wanted?
I mean, who at Knopf is here who had a hand in like putting the book to bed? Andrew Miller, when did you tell me no more? Or Zakia, one of you said no more facts. I think the last fact I snuck in was the woman who had known Harper Lee, and so I got this great Laurence Olivier story. She took reservations for Laurence Olivier when she worked for what was to become British Airways. But gosh, how did I not see you? The thanks. This is my editor, Andrew Miller, so if you love the insurance section, you have him to thank, and if you hate it, you have him to blame. He let me get away with a lot of stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's like a strict, editorial moment where they can't keep tinkering with things, but buy enough copies and I get a, second printing and I can add even more.
You can always update ebooks for printers.
Yeah, there you go.
I just want to give a shout out to your endnotes, which were fabulous.
My endnotes.
Your endnotes.
I like it. A real nerd. Wowza. Look at this.
They're like a real model of a kind of generosity of who helped you do things and what you read. They're amazing.
Oh my gosh, that's very kind. I did get the chance when truly one of the most eager audience members at one of these things was a woman who, if you've read the Voodoo Riff, there's something about the Seven Sisters, and they are very interesting, but I had a woman who was like, I need to know more about the Seven Sisters, and I was like, the endnotes, go forth and conquer. Yeah. Well, that's very kind of you. I enjoyed writing this book, and I couldn't have done it without, an incredible number of scholars and archivists and amateur historians, and it just feels like those are the people you ought to thank and lift up their work, and, I don't know how else you could do it, and again, thanks, Andrew, for the extra pages. I'm going to ask you in front of everyone, you're not, you shouldn't be with your wife, should you? Hasn't happened yet. Oh, okay. Andrew and his wife are expecting, so say a prayer for the two of them. Yeah, I was just worried I'd have to send you home.
Any other questions? I suppose, will you sign?
Yeah, absolutely. You guys missed out in Alex City. You could have had, Robert Byrne signing and Jim Earnhardt and all the Radneys and, the people in the book. But yeah, I'll sign.
Can I ask, how does that do readers come up and say, excuse me, could you sign this? Or... I
don't even remember how it started, but it just kept going. Because some of them came, I had real groupies in Alabama, like Jim, very sweetly.
You have real groupies
Jim,
here.
Jim, the incredible reporter in this book, who's a great example of, you've got to just keep talking to someone, but very sweetly he came to like 4 events, and he hadn't been to Nell Harper's grave, so we went to Monroeville together to visit her grave, and then at one point all of his siblings were there, and it was like, an Earnhardt reunion, so yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I don't really remember how it started, but it started, and then I would get these books that, had a bunch of other signatories already, so I can't forge theirs, but I can sign mine.
Well, I hope you all join me in thanking Casey and congratulating her on the book.